On today's program, I interview Kieran Mulvaney. Kieran Mulvaney is a boxing analyst for HBO, but not today. Today he's going back to his passion, and man, does it ever show. There's a huge difference in the Kieran Mulvaney that talks boxing and the Kieran Mulvaney that talks environmentalism. It was great to hear it. This man just came to life, and it was just the greatest thing. Regardless of your personal stance on climate change or environmentalism, I stand by it as being a great interview. Kieran Mulvaney is an author. He's written At the Ends of the Earth, The Whaling Season, and in today's show we'll talk about the great white bear, the polar bears, and how they relate to climate change. To learn more about Kieran Mulvaney, visit kieranmulvaney.com. And this isn't just a presentation. There is some interaction here. Make your comments below. I'm going to read them, so make your comments below. It creates some interaction, and that's what we're looking for. Comment, like the video, or dislike it, and subscribe to the channel. Thanks so much, and enjoy the program. Kieran Mulvaney, welcome back to the program.
Thanks very much for having me back. It's been far too long.
Yeah, it's been a few years, and we usually talk about boxing, but today we're going to do something totally different. We're going to go to your passion, and that's climate change, the environment, conservationism. What made you become such an environmentalist?
Well, that was really, it was my first love, and for a large part of my life, it was my life. I'm one of these people who was very fortunate. My parents had books, and I had lots of, National Geographic and Reader's Digest books about the world, and I would sit and read through these and flick through these. And my father was in the Navy as well, and he would tell me about his travels and would show me photographs of his travels, and it made me very curious about the world and wanting to see the world. But I kind of wanted to do what my dad did and see the world, but without the whole killing people thing. Quite early on, I became very interested in the idea of always loved animals, and very early on into the idea of protecting wildlife and the environment. And I started to do some work with a couple of environmental organizations in the UK out of school when I lived there. And that kind of blossomed into a couple of other things. And one thing that I became very interested in was whales and dolphins in particular. And I ended up co-founding an organization called the Whale and Dolphin Conservation Society when I was 19. And that's still going very well. And I'd been doing that for a little while when Greenpeace came and knocked on my door metaphorically and said, hey, look, we like what you're doing here. Would you like to come and work with us? And obviously, if you care about whales and dolphins, and especially if you want to stop whaling, there's nowhere else you'd rather go than Greenpeace. And I ended up leading a number of their expeditions to the Antarctic to go looking for the Japanese whaling fleet and to try to stop them from hunting whales. And I did that for quite a few years. And then when I left them in '95, worked with them on a consultancy-based basis, worked with a number of other different groups, then moved to Alaska and started to do a lot more specifically Arctic stuff. And that was just around the time where climate change was really becoming an issue. And ended up working with a couple of explorers who became the first people to make it to the North Pole across the ice of the Arctic Ocean during spring. Most of them do it, during later in the year, before when the ice hasn't melted, basically. And they were doing that to try to highlight the fact that ice was melting and to highlight the plight of the polar bear. And that led to my getting a lot more into researching polar bears, and ended up writing a book on polar bears a few years ago. So even though I still, I do a lot of boxing and I work with HBO, writing about and talking about and sort of somewhat campaigning on environmental issues and particularly things like polar bears in the Arctic is very much my love, I guess you could say. It's definitely my passion, as you said.
Whales, dolphins, polar bears. These are sort of the cute animals out there. They're not the only ones that are going extinct, of course. Kieran, we're in the Cenozoic age?
Right.
There have been many ages, many extinctions. Animals will not live forever.
Sure.
So far it's been somewhat proven. So the polar bear at some point will go extinct. Why is there a plight of the polar bear at all? We can't stop the eras from changing.
Sure. Well, although one would argue that we have, in fact, there's an argument that now this should actually be called the Anthropocene because of the Anthropocene era, because of the extent of the changes that we've wrought on the global environment. So it's actually an interesting philosophical question. On the one hand, you could say, well, look, in 5 billion years, the sun's going to swell up to a red giant and eat up the planet anyway. So on that level, sure, you can take a purely distant kind of approach to it and argue exactly what you have said, that change happens. Whether we don't have to dodge Tyrannosaurus Rexes because they're not around anymore. Polar bears will presumably go in the same way that the precursors to whales have gone, and the same way that there are no Neanderthals around anymore. Although, some people would question that if they're stuck in rush hour traffic. But so on one hand, you can take that view. There's another view that is, well, look, this is our planet, and we are on this planet. And while we are on this planet, it is somewhat our responsibility to not mess it up. And you can look at that from a couple of different perspectives. There's the perspective of, if you're a religious person, you might have in your religious text the notion that God gave unto humans stewardship of the planet, and therefore we're expected to exercise some responsibility. There's also just the basic ethical sense of we're here and it's incumbent upon us to not ruin the planet around us. And there's also, frankly, the utilitarian and anthropocentric perspective, which is it's not in our best interests. It is not in our best interests as humans existing now and for our future generations to warm the planet to the degree and the rapidity with which we're doing it. It is not in our interests to cut down tropical forests, the rate at which we're doing it, simply, if for nothing else, the fact that many of the drugs that we use in modern medicine have been isolated from tropical forest plants. It is not in our interest to cut down temperate forests and cause soil erosion, because that leads to tremendous amounts of flooding that affects us and also makes it, much harder to have soil that is useful for growing things in. So there's also a utilitarian perspective, that notion that it's just incumbent on us for our own survival and our own well-being. Well, so people can say, well, how the heck does a polar bear and the survival of the polar bear affect me in that respect? Well, that's because obviously the polar bear is a strong symbol of the Arctic. And we are affecting enormous change in the Arctic. And you can say, well, look, I don't live in the Arctic. I've got nothing to do with the Arctic. How does that possibly affect me? Again, if we're going to use that entirely utilitarian perspective, it's, first of all, both a symbol of, if the polar bears are disappearing, it's because sea ice is disappearing. And if sea ice is disappearing, that's because of climate change. And, we don't want to change the climate as rapidly as we're doing it. But also because a changing, melting Arctic affects the rest of the planet. We've been talking a lot about crazy weather, and particularly like in mid-latitudes. Over the last couple of years, and some of that might be like we might be having more extreme winters in, say, the north of the United States because a warming Arctic is changing weather patterns and so on and so forth. So we might want to care about polar bears because we just want to care about polar bears. We might want to care about polar bears because we feel that for spiritual or religious reasons it is incumbent upon us, or we might want to care about polar bears because, frankly, we're selfish and we think, well, shoot, we don't want to be messing the planet up to the degree that we're messing it up because it's just not going to be in our interest. And if the polar bear is disappearing, that doesn't work well for us. We better do what we can do to save the polar bear. So there are various different ways and different reasons to approach that and to be concerned.
But it's ultimately selfish. The polar bear serves as a canary in the coal mine. The birds are dying.
You can take, ultimately all of our actions are selfish. Even if you can take the philosophical argument that even if you are, that there's an argument that there's really no such thing from a biological perspective as a truly selfless act, because even if that selfless act, you think, well, that might rebound upon me at some stage, that's a good thing, I'm paying it forward, or, well, it makes me feel good, so therefore I get a good feeling out of the selfless act. So ultimately one can argue that all acts fundamentally, whether we think they are or not, are fundamentally selfish. And even if one is wanting to protect polar bears for their own sake, it's selfish because you like polar bears and you want to see polar bears around. So ultimately, there's self-interest involved in all of our actions as individuals and as societies. It's just a question of the degree to which are we only going to focus on ourselves? Are we only going to focus on ourselves here and now? Are we going to think about the consequences of our actions down the line, so on and so forth? So there are all those different ways and different means for looking at it and caring about it.
Okay, so there are reasons to care, but is it true? If you listen to Alex Jones, he'll tell you that the mainstream media is lying to you, that they're only showing you the pictures of the stranded polar bear on the iceberg, not telling you that polar bears can swim. You know, that the mainstream media is fake news. It's all a conspiracy to push the climate change agenda to tax the public.
I mean, so basically, the thing with climate change is fundamental physics. And as anybody who's ever watched Star Trek and listened to Scotty knows, you cannot change the laws of physics. And the fundamental laws of physics are: carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. That is to say, it helps trap heat in our lower atmosphere that would otherwise escape into space. We know that this is a fact, and it exists. And the fact that the greenhouse gas exists, the greenhouse effect exists, and that carbon dioxide is an element of that, is a very good thing. Without the greenhouse effect, none of us would be here. And this science was established way back in the 18th century and beyond. We're looking at guys like John Tyndall, Joseph Fourier, and after that, a guy called Svante Arrhenius, who actually examined the atmosphere, figured out why our planet kept some of the heat and why solar radiation didn't just disappear off. And in the case of Arrhenius, he actually calculated that, well, if we increase carbon dioxide, then therefore we're going to increase the greenhouse effect. So this is actually basic physics. And we know for a fact that carbon dioxide is increasing in the atmosphere. That is measured on a laboratory on Mauna Loa in Hawaii. We know definitively that temperatures are rising somewhat as one would expect it to be as a result of that carbon dioxide increasing. And we are seeing impacts that would be consistent with a warming world. So if we know what the physics are, if we know that the conditions exist to accentuate the impact of those physics, if we know that we are seeing results that are consistent with what we would expect from those physical changes, it has to be a real stretch to say, well, what about any of this is wrong? Those who say, well, it's all a conspiracy, first of all, it makes absolutely no sense. You are basically saying that pretty much every single researcher on Earth is engaged in some kind of conspiracy. Every scientific journal on Earth is engaged in a conspiracy. Again, leaving aside the laws of physics. Let's pretend that the laws of physics don't even exist. You're saying that all these scientists who are in the field, in Greenland, in the Arctic, in the Antarctic, around the world, are somehow engaged in a conspiracy that are pretending to see things that do not exist, or we are pretending that measurements exist that do not exist, that we are pretending that weather patterns exist that do not exist, that we are pretending that temperature changes are happening that do not exist. And all of this is some kind of global conspiracy because why exactly? All that is brought up is some kind of nefarious world government / taxation thing, which makes no sense at all. Because the solution, quite simply, to climate change, to increased fossil fuel burning, to increased levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is primarily through energy conservation. And we can do that through innovation. We can do that through more efficient use of or more efficient grids, for example. We are doing that through greater battery technology, which is interestingly able to store a lot more energy. Some of the work that Tesla is doing, not just on batteries in cars, but on batteries for use in households. We can do that through greater energy conservation, none of which we could do that just through putting solar panels on our roofs. We can do it through putting plants and gardens on top of roofs of skyscrapers in the cities. Believe me, the notion of some kind of weird global government has nothing to do with any of this. That is simply a result of tremendous lobbying by fossil fuel companies, even all of which now themselves even acknowledge the reality of global warming, to try in the past to force off any kind of effort to modulate or moderate or legislate against what's happening. And even the fossil fuel companies now will admit that they're investing in alternative energies. Even Exxon has been been forced to somewhat admit that they did studies into global warming back in the 80s internally and realized that it was in fact true, and they tried to cover it up. So if anybody tries to say, well, it's just a conspiracy, there's just not a sensible conversation that you can have with them, because there is mountains upon mountains upon mountains of data, huge amounts of observations, and again, there's inconvenient laws of physics. So it's simply a question, really, of what we need to do to try and address the situation.
Let's look at the numbers. So let's be scientific about it. Are the polar bear populations increasing or decreasing by the numbers?
So one of the difficulties that we have, some of them are decreasing. A couple of small ones seem to be stable or increasing. And for others, we simply don't have enough data. So if we look, for example, at the polar bears of the Beaufort Sea, they do not appear to be in a particularly good state. They appear to be declining. Just a little bit further to the west, some of the polar bears of the Chukchi Sea seem to be relatively stable. And you might say, well, why is that? That doesn't kind of make any sense whatsoever. Why would polar bears right here be declining, and why would polar bears over here be relatively stable? And that points to some of the complexity inherent in some of this. So it seems that in the Chukchi Sea, for example, the sea there is a bit shallower. And that creates conditions wherein a sea ice is able to last a little bit longer, particularly given that you have a couple of large islands there in the Chukchi Sea, which help disrupt the currents and help enable the sea ice to maintain a little bit longer. And polar bears need sea ice. So in this particular area where the sea ice is a bit more persistent, they're doing better. The Beaufort Sea, the sea ice is pulling away from land, and the Beaufort Sea is the area that's just north of Alaska. And there they appear to not be doing very well. And you talked earlier about the fact that polar bears can swim, and they can swim. They can swim very, very long distances, and that's one of the impressive things about them. They're adapted to swim, but having to swim those very, very long distances comes at an energetic cost. Everything in the Arctic comes at an energetic cost. You want to have to use up as little energy as possible. And so when you have bears that have to swim long distance to find ice, yes, they can do it, but it can tend to exhaust them. Hudson Bay, in Canada, the southernmost population, looks to have stabilized over the last couple of years somewhat, but the trend unmistakably is down, and that is simply because sea ice is melting earlier in spring and freezing later in fall. So they just have less time out on sea ice, and that is the problem that's affecting polar bears generally. There are a couple of small populations in the Canadian archipelago that there are a couple of studies of recently, and they're really quite small. We're talking like a couple of hundred, and they appear to be relatively stable. Part of the reason also that one has to also consider is that in some places polar bear populations are still rebounding a little bit from being massively overhunted in the 1960s, and so that factors into the equation. Around Svalbard, near Greenland, the sea ice has been particularly poor for several years now, and that raises a lot of concerns for the polar bears there in Svalbard. So the overall numbers are reckoned to be somewhere around 20 to 25,000 in the world, with no great precision within that number. Some populations, like I said, some of the populations that are most studied appear to be declining. Some are very data deficient. It's very hard to get to some of these places, particularly polar bear populations in Russia, and get a really good sense of what they're doing. And a couple of the smaller ones seem to be doing okay. The fate of the polar bear is very, very much, indeed it's inextricably tied to the fate of sea ice in the Arctic. And Arctic sea ice is declining rapidly, and that's why we're concerned about polar bears.
Interestingly enough, here in Canada, they are adapting. They're mating with grizzly bears, and we're seeing polar bear grizzly hybrids.
Yeah, and I wouldn't use the word adapting in that sense, because simply what's happening is that polar bears are being forced to spend longer amounts of time ashore because the sea ice is disappearing, and so as a consequence, they do come into contact with grizzlies more. And you hear some folks say, well, look, why don't they, Arctic grizzlies survive? Why can't polar bears just survive on the land? And Arctic grizzlies are the smallest grizzlies because going is tough in the Arctic, whereas polar bears are the largest bears. It's kind of interesting, the interaction between Arctic grizzlies and polar bears. Arctic grizzlies are much smaller than polar bears. But it's interesting that sometimes, as you said, they'll meet and they'll interact and they'll mate. Other times, Arctic grizzlies will bully polar bears, even though polar bears are the much larger bears. You know, to adapt the saying, it's not necessarily the size of the bear in the fight, it's the size of the fight in the bear. And grizzlies are territorial, aggressive species, whereas polar bears are not. And so sometimes researchers have found polar bears, say, gathering around a whale carcass and Arctic grizzlies coming into view, and the grizzlies kind of chase off the polar bears. So that level of interaction is interesting, and it remains to be seen quite exactly where that's going. But it's not so much an adaptation, them mating, it's just a consequence of the fact that polar bears are evolved from grizzlies, and the two certainly are capable of mating.
Did I overhear you say that you've been to Antarctica?
I have, yes, several times.
So you've been to Antarctica several times. That's incredible. That's more incredible than anything you've done for HBO boxing, that's for sure. Why the heck have we been talking about that this whole time?
You know, yeah, it's amazing. And you know what's also amazing? Such a stunningly beautiful but remarkably inhospitable, indeed positively hostile environment. And you know, when I've been down there, I've been on, you know, fairly modern, reinforced hull steel ships. And you think about the early explorers who went down, and they had no idea what they were to expect, and their idea of survival gear was an extra sweater, you know, and you can't help but go down there and be in awe of the early explorers who went down there and mapped the place and truly had no idea what on earth they were heading into. You know, when Captain Cook went down there, you know, initially he was under orders to go find this tropical paradise as was expected to exist down there, and he found quite the opposite. So
well, it has been a tropical paradise in the past.
Sure, but in 1770, it sure as heck wasn't. It's an amazing place.
You're like expecting Hawaii, and you get Antarctica. That's a bad vacation.
Right. He should have stayed down there. It didn't work out for him when he went to Hawaii. It all ended horribly. But
now, why don't we just take all these polar bears and round them up on giant tankers and take them to Antarctica and start reinvigorating the populations there? Wouldn't that work?
Excellent question, and one that's often raised. The big difference is that, you know, we look at the Arctic and the Antarctic, and we think they're fundamentally the same because they're both very cold. The Antarctic, and specifically the continent of the Antarctic, is a much more difficult environment than the Arctic. There's just not enough to sustain polar bears in the Antarctic. They would probably rip through the continent's penguin populations in a matter of years, and that would be the end of it. Polar bears are very specifically adapted. They eat a number of different seal species, but they're very specifically adapted to eat a very particular species of Arctic seal called the ringed seal. And the reason they've adapted to eat them is because ringed seals use these claws to make breathing holes for themselves, and polar bears are basically able to focus on the breathing holes of the ringed seals. But there's nothing like that for polar bears to survive on. The ocean around Antarctica already has a dominant predator in the form of orcas. There would just be no niche in which polar bears could fit. And the Antarctic, as cold as the Arctic is, the Antarctic is much, much, much colder and much harsher. So that wouldn't work. And secondly, although it's been very interesting, and no one's entirely sure why, although there are competing theories, although Antarctic sea ice has actually been very slightly increasing over the last number of years, even as Arctic sea ice has declined. We don't know if it's a temporary blip or not, but this last year it's decreased dramatically, and we don't know whether that's flipping.
Well, we just lost the Larsen sea shelf, no? Right.
Well, you've got two different things going on here. So you've got the Antarctic sea ice surrounding the continent, which is the rough equivalent of what polar bears deal with. And then you have land-fast glacial ice, the ice sheets, and so on around Antarctica, and they are indeed far from growing; they're disappearing. Larsen has been falling apart. First Larsen A, Larsen B, and now Larsen C. You have other ones. You have concerns about the Wilkes ice shelf, and so on and so forth. So those are in very grave danger. Indeed, the entire West Antarctic ice sheet is possibly over the course of decades or more, or centuries or more, in danger of collapsing completely. The other thing, by the way, with the whole polar bears to the Antarctic thing, is there's a difference in the way that the sea ice behaves around the Antarctic as the way to which it behaves in the Arctic. Basically, it stays in the Arctic all year round. It melts considerably during the summer, but there's still some there, and there's a place for the polar bears to kind of hang out, and then it grows again in winter. It pretty much all disappears completely in the Antarctic and then starts all over again. So the nature of that ecosystem down there is more different than you would expect, even though they are both sea ice environments.
What's the relative temperature? Like the temperature in Antarctica versus the temperature in the Arctic?
Now you've got me on the spot. You know, all I can tell you, right, is from experience. And when I've been down in the Antarctic in summer, when you say it can get pretty, you know, when you're basking in it being pretty warm, it's like 5 or 6 degrees Celsius, you know, and you're just like, wow, this is fantastic. Whereas I forget offhand. I couldn't even begin to tell you a figure because I just don't have it off the top of my head. But the coldest temperatures ever recorded on Earth anywhere are in the Antarctic, and not so much in the Arctic. You know, human beings can live in the Arctic, of course, as we well know, as Canadians well know. There have been populations living up in the Arctic for centuries and millennia even. Not the case in the Antarctic. It would be ridiculously difficult for that to happen.
Is climate change a fact, or is it still a theory? I mean, because, you know, you look at the States, right? It gets very cold in Boston and New York. Some of these are record snowfalls.
Okay, well, there's an important thing to point out here, and people latch onto this when they say, oh, climate change is just a theory. Even scientists will tell you that. In science, everything is a theory. Gravity is a theory. The Big Bang is a theory. That's just the nature of scientific terminology. However, you know, I think it's one of the difficulties that scientists have sometimes in talking to the public, because they will not express anything with 100% certainty. However, it's as close to certainty as we can get. And part of that, a large part of that, relates to the laws of physics that I talked about. We know that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, right? We know that. We know that carbon dioxide is increasing. We know that temperatures are increasing. Now, what you will sometimes get is you'll get people who are critics or skeptics or deniers, whatever you want to call them, will say, hey, they, whoever they are, changed the term from global warming to climate change because, you know, they wanted to be able to put, you know, all changes down to this. And it wasn't always warming. Things weren't warming the way that they said it would. Well, there's a couple of answers to that. First of all, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was established in the 1980s. And scientists have indeed been calling it climate change rather than global warming for a long time, precisely because even though the fundamental global mean average temperature is increasing as a result of the increased greenhouse effect, the enhanced greenhouse effect, that can manifest itself in different ways at different times regionally. And the most significant element of climate change is extreme weather events. And they can be depending on various local factors in various different ways. That can be drought in California. You can be having drought in California at the same time as you're having extreme snowfall in the Northeast. And the two can both be a component of climate change. And you'll get cynics and skeptics saying, oh, come on, you're just saying everything is climate change. But there are reasons why that can be so. So why, for example, would you have greater amount of snowfall in Boston in a winter because of climate change? Why would that make sense? Simply because it appears as if, and this gets us back to the thing at the very top of the show, how did declining polar bear habitats affect me? As sea ice declines in the Arctic, so ice is very high in what's called albedo. It reflects the sun's light. As you lose sea ice, you then have much more open ocean. Ocean is dark. It doesn't reflect the sunlight. It absorbs sunlight. That causes greater heating. And not only does that have a feedback effect and cause you to lose more ice, that also means that a greater amount of heat is rising from the Arctic. What that then does is disrupt the wind patterns that go around the Arctic, breaks them up, allows Arctic weather to descend down to the likes of Boston or here in Vermont. And meanwhile, you have the Atlantic Ocean is warming. So you have the cold air from the Arctic hits the warmer, moist air that's coming out of the Atlantic Ocean. That creates an environment for high precipitation, which, because of the air temperature, falls to snow. So that is how, for example, global warming can cause greater amounts of snowfall in Boston. And one of the things we would expect is more extreme winters in, for example, New England, where I am now. So you would have periods of relative warmth, as we've had this last winter, and nothing happens, followed by extreme snowfalls, which is what we had again this winter. So we're not entirely sure why it is that it is the extreme end of things that are affected more than more moderate things. I actually just recently talked to a researcher. I wrote an article about the fact that this one guy's done a study, and he's shown that air turbulence is almost certain to increase as a result of climate change affecting wind patterns and wind speeds. And he's found that extreme air turbulence is likely to increase at a far greater amount than moderate air turbulence. And he said, I still don't know why exactly that is, but it's weather extremes, it's climate extremes that are the things that we're most likely to see, and indeed are already seeing, whether that be long droughts, whether that be extreme rainfall, even in places, whether that be extreme snowfall. We can somewhat predict to a broad sense this region would be expected to experience this region would be expected to experience that. But on a short-term level, how weather reacts to a changing climate is less predictable than how in the long term, how climate is likely to change as a result of increased greenhouse gases.
Okay, so climate change is real.
Oh, yeah. I mean, everything is falling into place as it would be predicted to happen, right? Wow, if carbon dioxide increases to such a level, temperatures should probably increase to such a level. And that's kind of what they're doing. Now, also, by the way, you have a bunch of people say, oh, well, the temperature hasn't increased since 1998. That's factually incorrect, by the way. 1998 was an extremely warm year because of a very high El Nino. But it is incorrect to say that the temperature hasn't increased, that there's been a pause in global warming. The last 3 years, for example, have been progressively, 4 years, I think, even, been progressively the warmest on record. So when you have, these temperatures are increasing, and when you have, we're creating these circumstances that would cause temperatures to increase. And when you have all these other changes, for example, species migrating into different areas and so on and so forth, all the evidence is there to say, yes, this is absolutely happening. And if there is an alternative explanation for why temperatures are increasing, if there's an alternative explanation for why animals are migrating, if there's an alternative explanation for why we're having more extreme weather events, if there's an alternative explanation for why sea ice is disappearing in the Arctic, nobody knows what the heck it is. There's no other explanation. It isn't because the sun has increased its output, because that's not the case. It isn't that Earth's orbit has changed, because that's not the case. It isn't because there's been a wobble in Earth's orbit, because that's not the case. These are all the other factors that are involved in causing Earth's climate to change over the long term that it has done in the past. None of that is happening, and the climate is changing at a very, very rapid pace. So if somebody out there is able to figure out some reason other than increases in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere for why these changes are happening, a lot of people would love to hear from you.
Okay. So I buy it. Is there any hope for us, or have we already reached the tipping point and the Holocene extinction is inevitable?
That's an extremely good question. And I don't know that. And I think it's kind of a broad question. So in that, Yes, there's hope, basically, in that the solutions are within our grasp. And it's just simply, it is simply a case of, look, U.S. carbon dioxide emissions are now at something like 2005 levels, I think. The U.S. has reduced its carbon dioxide emissions. Partly that was initially due to the economic downturn, right? So there was less industrial output, people were using less energy and so forth. But it's continued beyond that as the economy has picked up. And that's partly the result of greater energy conservation measures, greater fuel efficiency standards, so on and so forth. So that's So that's good. China, thank heavens, appears to be aware of the role that it is playing and is investing very considerably in wind power and solar power. So yeah, absolutely. Now that all said, so yes, there are great improvements in technology, like I mentioned, battery technology. Solar panels are becoming much more efficient. The wind industry now in the United States employs more people than the coal industry does, for example. So yeah, absolutely. The problem is that there's a lag effect, that the carbon dioxide that is in the atmosphere now is going to stay there for a while. So we are going to continue to see impacts, even if we somehow stopped emitting carbon dioxide tomorrow, which isn't going to happen. We would still continue to see impacts. So there are concerns that, for example, the West Antarctic ice sheet is a dead ice sheet walking, that already it is undergoing a process of decay and decline that over centuries is irreversible. That's a problem. But we don't know that that's for sure, and that doesn't mean that we should just all give up and move into high mountain ranges to get away from coastal flooding. So the steps are there; they're incumbent upon us all. It's all pretty easy for us to do. It's a combination of technological developments and energy conservation. It's absolutely there. It's entirely doable, but we have to accept that we have set changes in motion that we are not going to stop immediately, and changes are afoot, and we're going to have to deal with them and adapt to them, even as we take the necessary measures to decrease our carbon dioxide output. And what is very key is that what we need to do is take these steps before we have far too strong feedback mechanisms. One of the big concerns, for example, there's a gas, methane is a stronger greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, but we emit it in less quantities. The concern is we need to take measures before, for example, permafrost, that level of which is the permanently frozen soil in the Arctic. If it starts to melt and release in large amounts and releases methane, then you're going to have very large feedback mechanisms, and then things may not be stopped. So the sooner we can take action, the better. We already are taking action. Carbon dioxide emissions from, for example, the United States and indeed some European countries are already declining. However, there is a lag effect, and we're going to have to buckle up, and things are going to get worse before they get better.
Brilliant show. Really enjoyed myself. Learned a lot. Thanks so much, Kieran. The book is The Great White Bear, A Natural and Unnatural History of the Polar Bear. Kieran, how can the audience get in touch with you?
Twitter's always good, at Kieran Mulvaney. You can always reach me there. I have a website, kieranmulvaney.com, where you can either send me an email or leave a message there on my website. Either way, I always like to try to get back to folks if at all possible.
Kieran Mulvaney, thank you so much for being a guest on the program.
Thanks very much. Let's not leave it so long next time.